Empire.
Hello and welcome to my podcast. Today we talk a lot of free agency with it starting March 17th with Nicki, Jhabvala, and Sam Fortier from the Washington Post. There's a lot to cover. We touch on some topics from Ron Rivera's press conference on Wednesday, then take a look at free agency and what we think might happen. Again, a lot to discuss. We talk about Brandon Sheriff and his situation. You can follow Sam on Twitter at Sam Fortier. Sam Fortier. Got it? Sam Fortier. And Nicki at Nicki Jhabvala, NICKIJHABVALA. You can read my work on ESPN.com. I'll have a free agent preview that should hit Friday morning. A lot of it is focused on positions of value and non-value. Would it be better to get player X in the draft or in free agency? So I'm going to go over all that, talk to a few people for that. And don't forget, when there's big news this offseason, I'm going to be doing an emergency podcast. Also, you know what? I kind of hate calling it an emergency podcast. I'm not saving your lives with the podcast. I'll call it a bonus podcast. How's that? And for those wondering about barbecue talk, I'll start including some of that in the future again as well. Probably maybe after the draft, because I got a few things for April that I want to leading up to the draft that I hope is fun and enjoyable. Before I get to Sam and Nicki, I wanted to give you a few thoughts. I'm going to hold off too much on Brandon Sheriff because we do discuss him. And actually, having said that, I do have a couple things to say about him. One thing to keep in mind on Sheriff, for 1 year, they can absorb this sort of hit on the franchise tag, and while they're still trying to work out a long-term deal. Now, I've told you before, I've heard for a couple of years, it seems that they're quote unquote close. All I know is Washington was hopeful for a long-term deal. They still don't have one. That's all. That's what I know for sure. I know that tagging players always complicates this process, and I think it has here. And again, you can go back to a couple of years where there were deals that were, again, I've told you before, that were turned down for whatever reason. But what I would do is continue to add more. If I'm the Washington, what I would do is continue to add more interior linemen and develop them. If Sheriff ends up leaving after this year, you have a cheaper in-house replacement. That's the way this works. If you lose guys, replace them in-house so you're not having to go out and spend money to replace a guy you lost because of money. You simply can't keep all your homegrown talent anymore because of the cost. I know there will be a glut of guards on the market. Washington lacks many, but here, one thing to keep in mind is that Washington lacks many players who you could consider are the best or among the top 2 or 3 at their position. Sheriff is one of those guys. I think Chase Young eventually will be one of those guys. Is there anybody else? No, there's not. Not at that level. And so I think that's something you have to keep in mind. They're paying that money for Brandon Sheriff, not just necessarily a guard. It doesn't mean that, you can just go spend on whatever. You're paying that for a guy that you think is a blue chip elite player at that position. You don't let those guys walk if you can help it. I just think whenever you tag someone twice, it becomes real difficult to get a deal done. So we'll see what happens. One thing working in Washington's favor here is line coach John Matsko. I've had a couple people tell me this, but the veterans do like playing for him because he listens to them and lets them do what they need to get ready. If a technique has worked for them, he lets them keep using it. He doesn't overwork them. Bill Callahan has a great reputation, is considered a great line coach, especially for younger players when developing them. But for a guy in Sheriff's situation, I think Matsko is probably a bigger help. Now, it clearly hasn't helped get the deal done, but I think it is part of the reason why Sheriff would like to stay here if possible. Doesn't mean it will, but it is something that works to the advantage here. I know as of earlier this week, there have been no contact between Washington and linebacker Ryan Kerrigan. No one should be surprised by this. I'll be interested to see what his market is. He's not getting mentioned with other pass rushers, and it's possible that others view him as a situational guy only, in which case he'd make around $5 or $6 million. I don't know if that's how all the league sees him, but when you see some of these lists, he's not necessarily always on there. So we'll see. Nothing has been ruled out to me about his future here. I just know the situation as of right now, and there had been no contact. So we'll see. Among other players they'd like to bring back, corner Ronald Darby, long snapper Nick Sundberg, kicker Dustin Hopkins, linebacker Kevin Pierre-Louis. Darby will be tricky because it's not a great corner market. Certainly not like last year where there were a couple top tier guys. I had one defensive back defensive backs coach me, tell me, pretty much said it was a terrible group in general because he saw some of the guys that he coached that were going to be free. And he's like, if this guy's considered up there, this people are in trouble signing guys. But one guy he did like was Ronald Darby. It does sound as if Darby will have a market. I think there has been some interest from a few teams in him. I would expect him to be in that 10 million range or so. I think he could probably ask for more, but I think if you're looking where he should be, that's the Kendall Fuller range. I think that's what would make sense for him. Ryan Anderson, he'll be gone. He wants to play outside linebacker in a 3-4 again, miscast as a 4-3 It's a better fit for him. Among other UFAs and RFAs, I would expect them to keep a guy like Danny Johnson. I don't know that they'll tender him, but I do know they do like him. They like his versatility and the fact that he can help as a returner. And when I say I don't know if they'll tender him, it's possible he returns on a 2-year deal or something like that rather than getting a tender offer. We'll see. I would think Cam Sims returns as an exclusive rights free agent. So, we'll see there. I've told you before I wouldn't hold out hope on Reuben Foster's return. He is a free agent. For some reason, earlier this season, offseason, there was some I don't know if somebody talked about that the contract might toll. No, it doesn't, because he was never put on the PUP list. He was on IR, so therefore he is definitely 1,000% free agent. But I've told you that before. I've heard from a few agents how much they like dealing with new general manager Martin Mayhew. Now, he's not in control of the money. That's Rob Rogers. And I was talking to Joe Corey, the CBS cap expert, former agent, the other day, and he said he always liked dealing with Rogers because he felt Rogers was open to more info during negotiations. Like if an agent came with some stats comparing his guy to another player who made a certain amount of money, that Rogers, he felt, would listen to it. Not everybody does. That works out or not, I don't know, but he does. It's at least agreeable or open to more information. With Mayhew, the big word I heard was trust. Agents trust what he says, and you best believe that matters when all things are equal. There were times here in the past where a player would be told one thing and another thing would happen when they get here, or they'd have the front office telling them how they would be used and the coaches would use them differently. That's happened here. That erodes trust. So that's one thing, I think ultimately things come down to money, but all things being equal, an agent will like to deal with a guy like that, and that can help him. Again, comes down to money, a lot of other, some other factors, but that's something that I think that I've heard from agents as well. Finally, with free agency starting next week, here's a little story from the old days and how crazy it used to be. Back in the day, the new league year would start at 12:01 Eastern time. So you'd have to stay up most of the night just in case, or following whatever, making calls, certainly before you could really do a lot of text messages. The worst time was when they signed Albert Haynesworth. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, and I could stop there with that statement and it would be accurate, meaning worst in Haynesworth. But that night, it was back and forth with him in Washington. Around 3 a.m., I got word, as did some others, that Haynesworth was out and that a visit had been lined up with defensive end Chris Canny. He was going to come visit, I think, the next day. That's the story I knew at that time. You put that out there. I think that must, at the time, just put it on your website. Canny was coming in for his visit. So at 3:30 a.m., I went to bed. I woke up somewhere between 5:30 and 6, only to see that they had already signed Haynesworth in the time that I was asleep. I'm glad that the new league year now starts at 4 p.m. Anyway, that's it from me. After this break, I'll be back with Nicki Jhabvala and Sam Fortier from the Washington Post. A lot to talk about: Ron Rivera's presser, Brandon Sheriff, and of course, free agency.
Support for this podcast comes from CDW and HP. At CDW, we get new ways of working bring new threats.
That's why we started an office commune in the wilderness. Not a security concern around, unless you count the wolves.
You know, at CDW, we can design a security solution using HP Elite devices with real-time threat intelligence to help protect your data anywhere you work.
Anywhere? Dress the donkeys! We're going back to the office!
For technology that moves you forward, trust HP and IT orchestration by CDW. People who get it. Learn more at cdw.com/HP security.
What's up? It's Mike Jones from the Football Jones Podcast. I know you're enjoying your time with the John Keim Report, but once you're done, I want to invite you to come over and check out my podcast. Each week, we take a deep dive into some of the most pressing topics around the NFL. high-profile guests from the coach, player, and front office ranks, as well as the top league insiders. Check out the Football Jones podcast, another fine product brought to you by Empire Media.
Welcome back. Now here's my conversation with Nicki Jhabvala and Sam Fortier. All right, well, we have free agency starting, I guess, in less than a week, and the legal tampering in a few days. We had today a Ron Rivera press conference. So before we get to free agency, I do want to touch on some of the topics. And for you guys, Nicki, Sam, whichever one you want to start first, what stood out to you about what Ron said today?
Go for it, Sam.
I think the thing that stood out to me besides the Brandon Sheriff contract talk, which I know Nicki will get to, was kind of the quarterback position. Obviously, he wasn't going to say, hey, we want to trade for Sam Darnold, or hey, we're really interested in Marcus Mariota once the Raiders cut him. But I do think that it reinforced perhaps even more than that first press conference in February that this team does not feel pressure to make a move. I don't know about you guys, but I sort of got the sense that, you know, if they don't like the trade package for Darnold, or if the money doesn't make sense with someone else, that they might, you know, consider rolling into this season with Kyle Allen. I don't think they'd like to, but that to me was sort of the read I had on Ron Rivera's comments today, that this team is prepared to not feel like it has to make a long-term move at quarterback. And I say that because specifically of Ron's comments about, you know, it's nice to think a guy is a franchise quarterback, but what happens when he gets here and starts playing? So I think that they want to be really calculated about this, obviously. And that to me was the strongest indication yet that they won't make a deal unless they feel it's the right one.
And Nicki, before we get to you, and because you can go talk about Brandon or whatever, but with sticking with the quarterbacks for a second, it also, you know, and it could be too that they're not going to certainly spend a lot to get a guy, and it may not be this big home run trade or move or anything like that, because I don't even know that exists. You know, that the ability, I don't know that they'd really be in on Deshaun, but it does seem like we're going to hear about them attached to a lot of guys because of the possibility of that. But yeah, I think it speaks to they don't feel like they have to improve everything right now in one offseason, and it allows you then to go build around that guy rather than just, you know, and allocate resources there if you want to.
I think it's also a factor of they just don't have many good options.
Right.
You know, they weren't able to get Matthew Stafford after getting outbid by the Rams. So I do wonder if part of this is tempering expectations, because there are not a lot of great options out there. I mean, maybe they try to get Darnold. Maybe, you know, they come away with Teddy Bridgewater if he comes available, you know, after his time in Carolina. I mean, but I think they know that none of these are going to be viewed as their long-term options. And, you know, that's just kind of the reality of where they're at with, you know, a low round pick and nobody really appealing in free agency. And there typically never is with quarterbacks, but, you know, they've made it pretty clear they're not going to mortgage the future to try to get Deshaun Watson. So, you know, they're not desperate, but they also don't have many great options. So who would they be desperate to go get even, you know?
Right. And that's why it could be just another stopgap and try again next offseason. So even whether you go with the Kyle Allen, Taylor Heineke, plus a veteran, it could be that veteran competes with them. And if nothing else, you have a stronger quarterback room, but you don't necessarily have your answer. And that's kind of is that how you see it, Sam?
Yeah. And I think when you think about kind of these situations in the past with different teams, I know a lot of people talk about, you know, either San Francisco with Jimmy Garoppolo or Minnesota with Kirk Cousins kind of maybe overpaying for that middle tier guy or the guy that you're not 100% sold on. So, you know, if you don't think that guy is out there, I think the stopgap, while probably not the guy that you want to have coming off the momentum of last season, not the guy that's going to fire the fan base up, this definitely would fit into the idea that Ron Rivera is talking about in terms of building something sustainable, not locking yourself in, not overpaying, and saying, okay, you know, this isn't ideal, but we're going to punt on this to next year.
I've been around for a lot of years where they fired up the fan base in March and it fell flat in September through December. So I think, you know, it's funny because I think what we saw last year with this too is they swung and missed on Amari Cooper, but then they got value in J.D. McKissick, Logan Thomas. And it's, so I think it should, just before we get to some other stuff, it's a reminder for people that just because you may not get a big name right away, it doesn't mean you're going to fall flat in free agency. So we've seen that here. We've seen that here in the past. So I think that's right. Nicki, what stood out for you today with Ron?
Is this when we're going to the Brandon Sheriff part? Because that was really what stood out to me. And it's really just one line where he said, I made this decision and I made it alone. I don't want to make too much of it. I don't want to insinuate that he went rogue and decided to just tag Brandon Sheriff. I don't think that was the case, but I thought it was, a subtle reinforcement that he has final say over personnel. And perhaps there was some disagreement in the room as to whether they should tag him. I mean, $18 million for a guard it's exorbitant. And I'm still a little stunned that they decided to tag him. I'm also surprised that Brandon hasn't signed it outright just to lock in $18 million for at least one season and then to become a free agent again next year. Because in my view, if you really like the guy and you're willing to spend $18 million, why aren't you able to reach a long-term agreement with him for, presumably a lower annual average value and a lower cap charge? That would make more sense for the team. And especially, there are going to be other guards on the market. There already are, and the Patriots are keeping Thuney. Zeitler was just released by the Giants. So there are other options out there that, maybe you could have gotten as much value at a much, lesser cost.
What do you think, Sam?
In terms of what Nicki said about the line and not making too much of it, it really struck me. It made me think of when they had the introductory press conference with Martin Mayhew and Marty Herney and Rivera. Rivera closed that press conference by saying, he seemed really giddy about the partnership. And he closed it by saying, if we do this right, there shouldn't ever be any disagreements. And while that might have been perhaps a little idealistic even at the time, I think that it was a little more measured today. It was a little more realistic about, you have this 6-man brain trust in the front office now, kind of spearheaded by those three at the top. But it does seem like maybe that there are, more logistical challenges than expected. And to go off Nicki's point, I mean, tagging Brandon Sheriff at $18 million a year, that's 130% more than the second highest paid guard, which is Brandon Brooks at an average of 14 per year. So, I'm not saying anything new by saying it's surprising that he play at $18 million this year. But when you do risk, kind of losing that guy for sure if he plays on the tag this year, and also trying to balance what Ron Rivera said about taking care of the guys in the locker room and showing the locker room they care about players, this is certainly a discordant example of that. And I just think it's going to be very curious how this plays out before they have that deadline on July 15th to sign him to a long-term deal, if that is a possibility.
Right. And here's where the flip side, and this is now the market is getting a little bit flooded with guards. And as Nicki said, we're starting to see that now. And my one thought with this was that, he is obviously a top guard. And if he's hitting the market, he is getting top guard money. So he's going to get probably around 16 million or so per year, somewhere around there. Right. And I think the thing that my thought process on it was, well, it allows you to keep this guy for another year. He is that good, and he's going to be better than anybody else in the market. To what extent? That's where you'd have to wrestle with it. But without a quarterback that they have to pay, you don't have that salary. And the top players are all on rookie contracts, the Chase Youngs, Montez, Allen Payne, Terry McLaurin. So it gives you that freedom this year if you wanted to keep a guy at that cost. That's the only way that I can justify that, right? Because otherwise, I told someone the other day, the only $18 million I'm paying for a guard, his name better be Michael Jordan, because it's like otherwise it's hard. I mean, I've had coaches here in the past who tell me you don't win with bleeping guards. The game is a little bit different now because there's more interior pressure. So you want that guy. He is one of your guys. But I think what I would do, and see if you guys agree, like even if you keep him, I'm probably going to draft a guy or find something else that I can maybe develop and then let him walk after next year. Because I'm not going to pay that much if I don't have to. Because now you're getting into encroaching on the defensive line contracts coming up. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's another important position that you're just kind of punting down the road till next year, which means there's more to do next year. I mean, you could be looking at still having to find a starting quarterback next year, still having to find a left tackle next year, figuring out how to pay the defensive line next year and, add to this, the right guard. So I feel like they had an opportunity twice now to try to, lock down a longer term contract. And if they viewed him as a longer term option, it would have gotten done. But if you don't view him as a longer term option, it seems silly to pay him $18 million a year for one season too.
I think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think they do view him as a long-term guy. I'm not sure that, he's in a position where it's harder to sign him because of those tags they placed on him. So I think do you think that that's part of the issue here, that tag complicates any kind of situation, any kind of negotiation like this?
Yeah, I think it raises the floor in negotiations. I mean, if you're in Sheriff's camp, why wouldn't it?
Right.
Clearly they're willing to pay him $18 million for, all right, well, that's the new floor for me. Let's start there with negotiations, So I think it makes it much more difficult. I think what's made it harder and I don't want to speak for all the teams, but it seemed like they really began talks as soon as the cap floor was announced. And that was announced so late in the process that I think it kind of hindered teams. They got a late start to all of this. And it wasn't until today that the final cap was announced. So, they really only had a week or so to try to nail it down. But then again, this is a team that they knew they had plenty of cap space. They knew roughly where the cap was going to be. But I do get the sense that a lot of teams are kind of waiting for that ballpark figure before they really dove into some of their bigger deals.
And, the other thing to keep in mind too, this group tagged Josh Norman a few years ago, and then they rescinded the tag. Now he signs it. This we can't do that. But that's why I almost wonder, it'd be interesting if you find a guy in the market you like, it's like, well, we can just get this guy and we'll rescind the tag. You know what I mean? So,
that's why I'm surprised he hasn't signed it. I mean, it's
right.
Lock it in,
Yeah. But I think, and he probably is thinking, well, if I sign it, we'll get the 18 million. If I don't sign it, I'll go out on the market and I'm going to make a ton of money. But, and that's not a guy who worries about money. I mean, you've seen some of the Instagram photos and stuff that he's put out there. Like, he doesn't seem like he's a guy who's stressed about this situation. So but yeah, I don't know. It'll be, I still, like I said, I would get someone in here to fill at a cheaper level. Like I said, if you get a guard in the draft that you can develop, or maybe an Ismail or maybe Sadiq Charles develops over here and you can do something with him. If you get another tackle in the draft, then maybe you have more options up front to replace him if you need it. But I would make sure I would do what I can. If you're going to keep him at that, then I would make sure that I have a cheaper, good replacement ready to go the following year. So that way you're not, like you said, Nicki, you're not searching for more answers than what they have now. So
just to kind of zoom out beyond the X's and O's of do you re-sign Brandon, I think Nicki made a good point about, punting down the road all of these pieces that you're going to have to build, center your rebuild around. And this is year 2 for Ron Rivera. This is, a big deal for him in terms of setting up maybe the cornerstones of the team that he's going to want to hit that window in year 3, year 4, year 5. And so to me, it's as much as it is about the logistics of can you pay Brandon and still be competitive long-term and pay the defensive line and all of those things. It's, if you're going to start identifying, okay, which 6 or 7 guys do we really want to pay? How do we handle really the foundation of this roster? I just think, and especially for a guy like Rivera who likes to retain and build around his own. Obviously, I know he didn't sign or draft Brandon Sheriff, but he's been in the building with him for a year. He knows who this guy is. So I do think this is a curious situation to see play out.
Absolutely. I think those are good points too. So I'm glad we touched on those. How aggressive do you think they will be in free agency, Nicki?
I'm honestly curious to see how aggressive they are. I mean, I think a lot of us go back and we reference that Amari Cooper play last year when they tried to get him and, reportedly outbid even the team he signed with. But I'm curious if they try to take the same approach and spend a lot of money on a receiver if they really don't know who their quarterback is going to be, or if they kind of follow the model that they created last year and going for less heralded options who they believe have some sort of untapped potential, like Logan Thomas or J.D. McKissick. I think it's an interesting time because they have a kind of a new front office. They have a new guy leading the personnel department. They have Chris Pullian in there now. They have Martin Mayhew and Marty Herney. I mean, how are all these guys going to come together to make the decisions? So I'm curious how aggressive they're going to be because they all have kind of different track records too. I mean, Martin has made some splash moves in Detroit that really set the team up well. I mean, that 2013 draft class he had was pretty impressive. But, I think the advantage that Washington has, and, Ron kind of hinted at this, but, they do have a lot of cap room to work with. And that's an advantage this year. Whether they really view it as that is one thing. But, this is a year where they do have considerable room to go get the guys they want and spend good money on them. I'm just curious how they view it, how they evaluate, the market for receivers, which is obviously deep, or if, they decide to turn to the draft for that. And same with tackles, same with tight ends. Do they value a veteran over a younger guy? There's a lot of unknowns still, I feel like, with this group.
No, there definitely is. And I also think like last year's a good model because to me, what it was with Amari Cooper was a guy they identified could be a difference maker for them. They were aggressive trying to go for him. It didn't mean they were going to go sign anybody willy-nilly like they have in the year. This is more years ago where they just say, okay, you're going to throw big money at this guy. You don't get him. Now go throw big money at that guy. It was more targeting a certain guy and then being aggressive to get that guy. Sam, you guys just wrote a free agency preview earlier this week on WashingtonPost.com. What positions do you think that you are looking for them to maybe attack more in free agency?
Yeah, I think beyond quarterback, beyond receiver, as we've talked about, offensive line as well. I think that the two that stand out to me are cornerback and linebacker. Starting with linebacker because Ron Rivera was really critical of that unit this year. And today when asked, kind of what he wants to address, I thought it was interesting. He brought up Kevin Pierre-Louis right away, especially because, KPL's snap counts diminished toward the end of the year. But I think when he says he's looking for a guy like that, maybe he's looking for a guy who's a little lighter, who can be in coverage, maybe Tennessee's Jayon Brown or Buffalo's Matt Milano. Those two guys are probably going to be the top coverage linebackers on the market this year. Over the cap projects that they'd be worth probably about $10 million per year over 3 or 4 years. So I think that's kind of the position, and those are the guys who, if you don't re-sign KPL, make a lot of sense. And then at quarterback, I think the question is, can you re-sign Ronald Darby? He's probably, one of the better corners on the market this year, maybe, worth $9 or $10 million per year as well. But those two units, to me, are kind of the ones that you would want to solidify when you talk about this defense moving forward. Obviously, the defensive line is going to be just fine. And at safety, even, no matter what happens when Landon Collins comes back with Cam Curl, you probably feel good about that. And the team is expected to have interest in Carolina safety Trey Boston as every former Carolina Panther is probably going to have interest here. But I think, those two positions, corner and linebacker, are the ones that I'd probably focus on, in the immediate future.
Hey, Nicki, going back to that story, are there some names that you think that you're on the lookout for more than others?
I'm curious about the free safety market. My only concern is, they have a lot of cap space already allocated to Kendall Fuller and Landon Collins. Can they really afford to, allocate more to a free safety? Because it's a deep class of guys. I mean, Justin Simmons is off the board, but, maybe Anthony Harris or somebody from Minnesota I thought would be intriguing because they do have talent back there in the secondary, but they don't really have a true free safety. I think Cam is more of a strong safety. And I don't know that Landon Collins is going to be here beyond the season unless he really balls out of his mind coming back from injury. As far as receiver, I mean, I thought it was really interesting that Kenny Golladay is now free. I mean, he's going to get a ton of money. But then again, I do kind of wonder if the veteran class of free agents, if their value gets pushed down slightly because it's another deep class in the draft for receivers. I mean, do teams feel like they can get a better value even in a day 2 pick, kind of like Washington did with Terry McLaurin, and save the money there? Or do they go after, a guy and spend big on, Kenny Golladay and, a lot of other names out there? I was kind of hoping that they would consider Taylor Moton, though I know Carolina was probably going to tag him anyway, and they did. But I do think that's a position that is so often overlooked. It's hard to find a left tackle. I get it. They don't come on the market all too often, and they're going to cost you. But I think I don't know. I feel like it's important to invest in the front line, and I feel like many teams still don't do that, especially teams like this one that has a young offense and could likely have a young quarterback for the foreseeable future, whether he's on the roster or, in the future. So that's, I mean, I would like to see them spend the money there. Also, Hunter Henry's on the market too. I mean, if you're not going to spend big on a receiver, maybe you go after a tight end, a guy that can kind of do it all and pair him with Logan Thomas. I think that could be intriguing.
I'm with you on that one. That's the position that I'd look at because this draft is so deep at receiver that I don't know that I'd break the bank there, but I like whether Hunter Henry or Jonnu Smith. I'm a big Jonnu guy. But it's the same position, same line of same rationale. Last thing, do you think they will find their quarterback in the next couple of weeks? Or a quarterback? They're the quarterback for at least 2021.
It like we've said, it's a limited talent pool. I think Marcus Mariota, if he were to come available, if the team were to release him, I think if the Raiders were to release him, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know Joe Theismann has compared him to, he thinks Mariota is capable of being the next Ryan Tannehill in terms of maybe someone who didn't get off to the best start in his career and could maybe come to an offense that's young, that's growing, and sort of reinvent himself. Maybe show that he's a little bit better than he did in his rookie contract anyway. I think if that were to happen, that would make sense to me. Maybe not the Darnold trade, because then you'd either have to decline his option or lock into him for the year after. But again, as we've said, I think they're going to be judicious about it. And if it happens, I think they'll be okay with it. If it doesn't, I think they're going to be okay with punting.
I think it will. I don't think it's going to be a great option. Like maybe, they get a Ryan Fitzpatrick type. I wouldn't put him out of the running for Sam Darnold. Whether you agree with it or not, maybe they view him as a guy that, would have more success here with a new quarterbacks coach, new system, fresh start. Maybe they view him as kind of their Goff going from Jeff Fisher to Sean McVay. Who knows? I mean, I do think he was a first round pick for a reason. There certainly is some potential there. You do have to be careful though, obviously, because as Sam mentioned with that 5th-year contract, which becomes fully guaranteed immediately, that's, you're basically giving him a 2-year fully guaranteed deal. Do you want that in a guy like Darnold, or do you just want a 1-year prove it guy, and maybe wait to see, what happens with Bridgewater, or if you can trade for Mariota? I don't love the idea of trading and giving up draft capital in a year where you still have a ton of holes to fill across the roster. But again, it's not like they have a ton of great options. And I would be surprised if they went into the offseason with just Taylor Heineke, Kyle Allen, and Steven Montez. I just can't see that.
Yeah, I'd be really surprised by that. And I think, it's funny that we bring up Darnold, because I think with Darnold, so much of it depends what you thought of him coming out of college. Yeah. And it's funny because when I talk to people, they reference his Ohio State game in the bowl game after his last year. And it's almost that game is almost like a Rorschach test, because some people saw the competitiveness of him. That's why they love him, because he was tough. He got hit. He kept bouncing up. other people saw the continuous turnovers that have followed him to the NFL. And so for that reason, they don't want him. And so to me, he's as divisive as any. So if you get him, I think you better be prepared to to keep that option, because you probably liked him coming out. Whereas Mariota, you're going to take a flyer on him because he's going to be costless.
And I think if you're taking on a young guy, I mean, I think this is just my opinion. I feel like teams have been chasing the Pat Mahomes, more recently than ever. And, so these younger guys get basically a 5-game tryout where if they don't show out in that time, then they just move on from them, without really giving credence to the fact that coordinators change and systems change and quarterback coaches change. And there's a lot of moving parts around these guys, and it doesn't necessarily always fall on them. So I think if you're going to take on a guy like that and he needs some development, it only makes sense to give him the time to develop. And while I realize not every quarterback is Josh Allen and he's rare, I mean, I think you do have to look at the fact that, he was pretty inaccurate coming out of Wyoming, and look at what he's done in his time with some continuity around him in Buffalo. That should be the goal for a young quarterback in my mind. And if you take on a player like that, it's about building around him more so than just figuring out if he and he alone works.
And the thing that no one talks about with Sam Darnold is that if you trade for him, you now have 2 redheads named Sam in and around the building, which obviously would be a huge boon for the franchise.
Do you think he would try out for iCarly too? Is that like competition for you, or? I mean,
no, he can't try out against me. That I don't do well under pressure.
Wow.
I think that would be fantastic, though. And I had not thought of that possibility. And listen, this franchise did well with the redheaded quarterback back in the 60s and Sonny Jurgensen. So, but a little bit even before my time, for God's sake. So, but yeah, Sam, I think, was he on, what was the Dragon show?
Dragon Tales, man.
Dragon Tales. There you go. He wasn't on that, was he?
No, I don't believe so. My acting credits are a little bit deeper than his, but I think he's certainly outdone me as we became teenagers.
Are they going to do a reboot of Dragon Tales? You heard anything on
that? Multiple sources have not said anything to me about that. So I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, just call his agent for that.
Okay. Well, I think this is the point where we probably have to wrap up. If we're on to Dragon Tales, then that's the line of demarcation. So, hey, Sam, Nicki, thanks for coming on. Everybody, I already told you where you can follow them, and you can pay attention to that and go follow them on Twitter. If you guys got anything you want to plug right now?
Nope, I'm good.
WashingtonPost.com. That's it. All day, every day.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having us, John.
Support for this podcast comes from Wild Turkey Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Let's tune in to their one-on-one with Jamal, a real bartender from Old Fourth Ward in Atlanta.
I really get into the backstory of whatever I'm pouring, out of respect. There are literally years of experience behind these bottles. Wild Turkey, same recipe since 1942. If you want a true classic, this is what you want to order.
Wild Turkey. Wild Turkey Distilling Company, Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. Copyright 2020, Campari American, New York, New York. Never compromise, drink responsibly.
Support for this podcast comes from WGU. Do you want a more skilled and effective workforce? Do you want to build loyalty and increase employee retention? A partnership with Western Governors University could be exactly what you need. Over 300 organizations nationwide already count on WGU for valuable education benefits that lead to better prepared and more capable workers. With more than 60 accredited bachelor's and master's programs to choose from, and shorter credential programs coming soon, WGU has long been a leader in making quality higher education more accessible. Flexible online learning is the key. Students can fit schooling around their existing schedules and even complete courses and degrees sooner than planned. WGU makes earning a respected degree possible with just a computer and an internet connection. Partner with WGU today to make a smart investment in your company's and employees' future. Learn more at wgu.edu/partnerships. That's wgu.edu/partnerships.
Hey, this is Joel Corey from Inside the Cap. I know you're enjoying the John Keim Report, which gives you insider access to the Washington football team, everything you want to know, which is going on with the Washington football team. Once you're done with that, check out my podcast, Inside the Cap, which gives you the ins and outs of the NFL salary cap and player contract negotiations. Check out these two products and other fine podcasts from Empire Media.
That's it for this week. Thanks to Sam and Nicki for joining me, and thank you, as always, for listening. I'll have another podcast out Sunday night and whenever there's big breaking news. Talk to you next time.